On May 29th, 1453, the walls of Constantinople, which had stood for over 1,000 years, finally cracked. Mehmed II, 21 years old, rode through the breach as the last Roman emperor died fighting in the streets. The city that had survived 23 sieges fell in 53 days to an empire that didn't exist 2 centuries earlier. This is the story of how a minor Turkish tribe built one of history's largest empires, ruled 3 continents for over 600 years, and then collapsed so completely that its heartland became a secular republic that banned its symbols, abolished its institutions, and erased its name from maps. The pattern isn't just about conquest and decline. It's about how empires plant the seeds of their own destruction at the height of their power. How military excellence becomes military obsolescence. How tolerance becomes oppression. How innovation becomes stagnation. The Ottoman Empire rose because it adapted. It fell because it stopped. Let's start at the beginning, with a man whose name would define an empire. Osman I was born around 1258 in Söğüt, a small town in northwestern Anatolia. His father, Ertuğrul, led a band of approximately 400 horsemen, nomadic Turks who served as frontier warriors for the Seljuk Sultanate. When the Mongols destroyed the Seljuk state in the late 13th century, dozens of small Turkish principalities emerged from the chaos. Osman inherited one of the smallest and poorest. What Osman understood was geography. His beylik sat on the border between the weakening Byzantine Empire and the collapsing Seljuk state. While other Turkish leaders fought each other, Osman looked west toward Byzantine territory. He didn't just raid, he conquered, held, and integrated. When he captured a Byzantine fortress, he didn't slaughter the garrison. He offered them a choice: convert and join him, or leave in peace. Many stayed. This policy became the foundation of Ottoman expansion. The empire grew not just through conquest, but through incorporation. This looks like genius. But watch what happens when genius becomes tradition, tradition becomes law, and law becomes a cage. Christians who converted to Islam could rise to the highest positions. Greeks, Armenians, and Serbs served as soldiers, administrators, and advisors. Osman created a state that rewarded loyalty and ability over ethnic origin. By 1326, when Osman died, his small beylik had grown into a regional power controlling significant Byzantine territory. He never called himself sultan. He used the title bey, leader. The name Ottoman comes from the Arabic version of his name, Uthman. His descendants would rule for nearly 600 years. Osman's son, Orhan, expanded the state dramatically. He captured Bursa in 1326, making it the first Ottoman capital. He took Nicaea in 1331 and Nicomedia in 1337, cities that had been major Byzantine centers. But Orhan's greatest innovation wasn't military. In 1346, he crossed the Dardanelles into Europe. The Byzantine Empire was collapsing from civil war. John VI, Cantacuzenus, fighting for the throne, invited Orhan's Turks to help him. Orhan sent 6,000 men. They won the civil war for Cantacuzenus. Then they didn't leave. They established a fortress at Gallipoli in 1354. The Ottomans now controlled both sides of the Dardanelles, the gateway between Europe and Asia. Orhan also pioneered a standing army model that would later evolve into the Janissaries. He took Christian boys as tribute, converted them to Islam, and trained them as elite soldiers. These boys had no family ties, no local loyalties. They served only the Sultan. This created a military force more loyal and disciplined than any feudal army in Europe. Remember this system? It wins empires, then it destroys them. Orhan died in 1362. His son Murad I inherited an expanding state and accelerated the conquest. Murad captured Adrianople in 1369 and made it his capital, renaming it Edirne. This wasn't just symbolic. By moving the capital into Europe, Murad announced that the Ottomans were a European power now, not an Asian frontier state. Murad formalized the devshirme system, the practice of taking Christian boys. Every few years, Ottoman officials traveled through Christian villages in the Balkans, selecting boys between 8 and 18 years old. The quotas varied, but the pattern held: young boys taken from their families, converted, trained, and transformed into the empire's elite. The most intelligent became administrators. The strongest became janissaries. The most exceptional entered the palace school and could rise to become grand viziers, the Sultan's chief minister. This system sounds horrifying to modern ears, and for the families losing sons, it was. But within the Ottoman system, it created opportunity. Devshirme boys could achieve power and wealth impossible in the rigid class structures of Christian Europe. Multiple grand viziers were born Christian in Balkan villages. The empire's most effective administrators often came from this system. Here's the trap. A system that recruits talent based on merit sounds perfect. But when that system becomes hereditary, when janissaries pass positions to their sons, when administrators buy offices instead of earning them, genius becomes corruption. Murad conquered most of the Balkans. Serbia, Bulgaria, and much of Greece fell under Ottoman control. At the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, Murad defeated a coalition of Serbian and Bosnian forces. He died on the battlefield, allegedly assassinated by a Serbian knight, but the Ottoman victory was complete. The Serbs became Ottoman vassals. Murad's son Bayezid I earned the nickname Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the speed of his campaigns. Between 1389 and 1402, he conquered most of remaining Anatolia and pushed deeper into Europe. He besieged Constantinople in 1395, the first Ottoman siege of the city that would obsess the empire for decades. But Bayezid made a fatal error. He antagonized Timur, the Central Asian conqueror who had rebuilt much of Genghis Khan's empire. When Bayezid refused Timur's demands to return territory, Timur invaded Anatolia with massive forces. The armies met at Ankara on July 20th, 1402. The battle was catastrophic. Timur's forces surrounded the Ottoman army. The Anatolian Turkish vassals, who Bayezid had recently conquered and forced to fight, defected to Timur during the battle. The Ottoman army was destroyed. Bayezid was captured and died in captivity 8 months later. The Ottoman state fractured. Bayezid's sons fought each other for 11 years in what historians call the Ottoman interregnum. Timur could have destroyed the Ottoman state entirely, but chose not to. He died in 1405, and his empire quickly fragmented. Mehmed I eventually won the civil war in 1413. He spent his 9-year reign stabilizing the state, suppressing rebellions, and recovering lost territory. When he died in 1421, he left his son, Murad II, a reunified empire. Murad II faced a new threat: the Crusades. European powers, alarmed by Ottoman expansion, launched multiple crusades to push the Turks out of Europe. Murad defeated Crusader armies at Varna in 1444 and Kosovo again in 1448. These victories broke the back of organized Christian resistance to Ottoman expansion in the Balkans. When Murad died in 1451, Mehmed II inherited the most powerful state in the eastern Mediterranean, and Mehmed had an obsession: Constantinople. The city had been the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years. It sat on the Bosporus, controlling trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Its walls, built by Theodosius in the 5th century, had resisted 23 sieges. The city had shrunk from a population of hundreds of thousands to perhaps 50,000, but it remained a symbol. As long as Constantinople stood, the last surviving Roman Empire existed. Mehmed became Sultan on February 18th, 1451, at age 19. Within months, he began preparing for the siege. He built Rumeli Hisar, a fortress on the European side of the Bosporus, directly across from Anadolu Hisar. Together, these fortresses controlled the Bosporus. No ship could pass without Ottoman permission. Constantinople's emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, knew what was coming. He appealed to Western Europe for help. The Pope promised aid if the Orthodox Church accepted union with Rome. Constantine agreed, but the union was so unpopular in Constantinople that it weakened rather than strengthened the city's defense. Western help never materialized in meaningful numbers. A few hundred Italian mercenaries arrived. That was all. Mehmed assembled an army estimated at 80,000 to 150,000 men. He commissioned Urban, a Hungarian engineer, to build the largest cannon ever made. The cannon, nicknamed Basilica, was 27 feet long and weighed 19 tons. It fired stone balls weighing hundreds to over 1,000 pounds. It required 60 oxen to move and a crew of 200 men to operate. The cannon could fire only a handful of times per day because it overheated and cracked. The siege began on April 6th, 1453. Mehmed's cannons bombarded the walls continuously. The Theodosian walls, which had stood for 1,000 years, cracked and crumbled under the bombardment. But Constantine's defenders repaired the walls every night. The Byzantines stretched chains across the Golden Horn, the harbor, to prevent Ottoman ships from attacking from that side. Mehmed solved this problem with an engineering feat that shocked contemporaries. He built a wooden road behind Galata, greased it with animal fat and soap, and used oxen and soldiers to drag 70 ships overland and into the Golden Horn. When Constantinople's defenders woke up on April 22nd, an Ottoman fleet sat in the supposedly protected harbor. The siege lasted 53 days. Constantine refused multiple offers to surrender. On May 28th, Mehmed ordered a final assault for the next day. That night, Constantine addressed his remaining defenders. He told them they were fighting for faith, for family, for country. He asked forgiveness from anyone he had wronged. Then he removed his imperial regalia and joined the soldiers on the walls. The assault began before dawn on May 29th. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops attacked the walls. The defenders held for hours. Then a small gate called the Kirkeporta was discovered open. Ottoman troops poured through. Constantine died fighting. His body was never definitively identified. According to legend, when he saw the walls breached, he tore off his imperial purple and charged into the fighting, dying as a soldier, Rather than fleeing as an emperor, Mehmed entered Constantinople on horseback. He went directly to the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom. He climbed to the dome and ordered it converted into a mosque. He made Constantinople the Ottoman capital, what people increasingly called Istanbul. The city would remain the Ottoman capital for 469 years until the empire's collapse. Mehmed repopulated the city by ordering families from across the empire to move there. He allowed Greeks, Armenians, and Jews to form their own communities called millets, with their own leaders and courts. The Ottoman Empire would rule through this millet system for centuries, allowing religious and ethnic autonomy as long as communities paid taxes and provided soldiers. The conquest of Constantinople marked the definitive end of the last surviving Roman Empire. It also marked the Ottoman Empire's transformation from a frontier state into a major power. European powers could no longer ignore or dismiss the Ottomans. The empire now controlled the critical straits connecting 2 seas and 2 continents. Mehmed spent the next 30 years consolidating his conquest and expanding the empire. He conquered Serbia completely, the Empire of Trebizond, Bosnia, Albania, and much of the Crimean Khanate. He died on May 3rd, 1481, at age 49. His death triggered another succession crisis. Bayezid II won the civil war and ruled for 31 years of mostly peaceful consolidation. But in 1512, his son Selim forced him to abdicate. Selim had his father poisoned shortly after, and had his brothers and all their sons killed to prevent succession disputes. They took the city. Now they had to figure out how not to lose it. Selim I ruled only 8 years, but doubled the size of the empire. He turned south and east, conquering the Mamluk Sultanate that controlled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. In 1517, after defeating the Mamluks at the Battle of Ridania, Selim entered Cairo and claimed the title of Caliph, successor to Muhammad and leader of all Muslims. This transformed the Ottoman Empire from a powerful regional state into the preeminent Islamic power. Control of Mecca and Medina gave the Sultan religious authority across the Muslim world. The Caliphate would remain with the Ottoman sultans until 1924. Selim died in 1520. His son Suleiman inherited an empire at its peak, controlling Anatolia, the Balkans, the Levant, Egypt, and much of North Africa. Suleiman would become known to Europeans as the Magnificent, and to Turks as the Lawgiver. His 46-year reign represents the Ottoman Golden Age. But even at this peak, the seeds of decline were already planted. Watch how the systems that built the empire slowly turn against it. Suleiman I became Sultan on September 30th, 1520, at age 25. European observers expected him to be a peaceful ruler after his father's constant warfare. They were catastrophically wrong. Suleiman's first campaign, in 1521, captured Belgrade, the key fortress protecting Central Europe from Ottoman expansion. His second campaign, in 1522, conquered Rhodes from the Knights Hospitaller after a 6-month siege. These victories opened the way to Hungary and the Mediterranean. The decisive campaign came in 1526. Suleiman invaded Hungary with approximately 100,000 troops and 300 cannons. King Louis II of Hungary met the Ottomans at Mohacs on August 29th. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. The Hungarian army was destroyed. King Louis drowned while fleeing. Hungary effectively ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. The Ottomans annexed southern Hungary directly and made the rest a vassal state. Suleiman pushed deeper into Europe. In 1529, he besieged Vienna with 120,000 troops. The siege lasted 3 weeks. The defenders held out. Winter approached, and Suleiman's supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles. He withdrew on October 15th. Vienna would remain the northwestern limit of Ottoman expansion. While Suleiman campaigned in Europe, his admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa dominated the Mediterranean. Barbarossa captured Tunis, raided the Spanish and Italian coasts, and defeated Holy League fleets at Preveza in 1538. The Mediterranean became an Ottoman lake. But Suleiman's greatest legacy wasn't military. He reformed Ottoman law, creating a comprehensive legal code called the Kanuname. He built mosques, bridges, aqueducts, and public buildings across the empire. The architect Mimar Sinan, born a Christian Greek and taken through the Devshirme system, designed the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, which still stands as one of the world's great architectural achievements. Suleiman's personal life, however, planted the seeds of institutional decline. He fell in love with Roxolana, known in Turkish as Hürrem Sultan, a woman taken into his harem. This shouldn't have mattered. Sultans had harems, but Suleiman made Roxolana legally his wife, breaking an Ottoman tradition that sultans didn't marry. He gave her unprecedented political power. Here's where the trap closes. The system says the most capable heir becomes sultan. But what happens when the sultan's wife decides capability doesn't matter? Roxolana had 4 sons with Suleiman, but Suleiman also had a son, Mustafa, from another concubine. Mustafa was the oldest, the most capable, and the expected heir. Roxolana saw Mustafa as a threat to her own sons. She convinced Suleiman that Mustafa was plotting rebellion. In 1553, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his campaign tent in Ereğli. When Mustafa entered, mute executioners strangled him with a bowstring as Suleiman watched. Mustafa was 38 years old, a proven military commander, and popular with the army. The Janissaries nearly revolted. Mustafa's execution meant Roxolana's son, Selim, would likely become sultan. And everyone knew Selim was incompetent, weak, and an alcoholic. Mustafa's death represented the triumph of harem politics over meritocracy. It established a precedent that would haunt the empire for centuries. Capable heirs could be eliminated if they threatened the wrong people's interests. Roxolana died in 1558. Suleiman lived 8 more years, dying in 1566 during a campaign in Hungary. He was 71 years old and had ruled for 46 years. When his son Selim II became sultan, the decline began, and the empire would spend the next 3.5 centuries trying to stop it. Selim II was called the Sort for his drinking. He was the first sultan to show no interest in military campaigns or governance. He spent his reign in the harem, while his Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, actually ruled the empire. This established another dangerous precedent. Sultans didn't need to be capable because their ministers would govern. The one major military event of Selim's reign was disaster. In 1571, an Ottoman fleet sailed into the Gulf of Patras to face a Holy League fleet. The Battle of Lepanto on October 7th destroyed Ottoman naval dominance. The Holy League sank or captured over 100 Ottoman galleys and killed approximately 30,000 Ottoman sailors and soldiers. The empire rebuilt the fleet within months, demonstrating its enormous resources. But Lepanto broke the psychological dominance Ottoman fleets had held. More importantly, it revealed a strategic problem. The empire's expansion had reached natural limits. To the west, Habsburg powers were too strong. To the north, harsh terrain and long supply lines made permanent conquest impossible. To the east, Safavid Persia was a peer competitor. To the south, only desert. The age of easy expansion was over. Now came the hard part, maintaining what they'd built. Selim died in 1574. His son Murad III became sultan and ruled for 21 years, spending most of his time in the harem. He fathered over 100 children, the most of any Ottoman sultan. When he died in 1595, his son Mehmed III became sultan and immediately had his 19 brothers strangled to prevent succession disputes. This practice, called fratricide, had been common since Mehmed the Conqueror. The logic was brutal but simple. Better one son die by execution than the empire die from civil war. But Mehmed III's mass execution of 19 brothers shocked contemporaries. The practice became unsustainable. Mehmed's son, Ahmed I, abolished fratricide in 1603. Instead of killing potential heirs, they would be confined to the cafes, the cage, a section of the palace where princes lived in luxurious imprisonment. They had servants, concubines, and every comfort except freedom or education in governance. When a sultan died, the oldest male in the dynasty became the next sultan, whether he was the previous sultan's son or brother or cousin. This system sounds more humane than fratricide. But watch what it creates. Sultans with no training in governance, no military experience, and sometimes severe psychological problems from years of imprisonment. The empire would be ruled by capable grand viziers, while damaged sultans reigned in name only. Between 1603 and 1648, the empire fought a series of wars with Persia, Austria, Poland, and Venice. Some were won, some lost, but none resulted in significant territorial gains. The empire was stagnating militarily, while European powers advanced rapidly in technology and organization. The Janissaries, once the empire's elite fighting force, became a corrupt political faction. They had been forbidden to marry, own property, or have outside employment. These restrictions were relaxed. Janissaries now married, ran businesses, and sold their positions to their sons. They became a hereditary caste resistant to any reform that threatened their privileges. In 1622, the Janissaries deposed Sultan Osman II and had him strangled in prison. He was the first sultan killed by his own troops. This established that the Janissaries could make and unmake sultans. For the next 2 centuries, no sultan could reform the military without risking assassination. The genius system that created the empire was now strangling it. The empire's economic foundation was also weakening. Ottoman prosperity had been based on controlling trade routes between Europe and Asia, but Portuguese, Dutch, and English merchants were now sailing around Africa to reach India and China, bypassing Ottoman territory. The discovery of the Americas shifted Europe's economic center from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. The Ottoman Empire, which had been at the center of world trade, was becoming peripheral. Silver from American mines flooded into Europe and then into the Ottoman Empire through trade. This caused inflation that the Ottoman government couldn't control. Prices rose, Fixed revenues from taxes bought less, and soldiers and administrators demanded higher salaries. The empire debased its currency, which caused more inflation. Corruption metastasized through the system. The Devshirme system had created capable administrators because they were chosen for ability and trained for decades. But by the 17th century, positions were being sold. Someone could buy the position of governor or judge without any training or merit. These officials then extorted money from their provinces to recoup their investment and make a profit. The millet system, which had allowed religious and ethnic autonomy, began to crack under pressure. As the central government weakened, it relied more on tax farmers, intermediaries, who paid the government a fixed sum and then collected whatever they could from the population. These tax farmers were often members of the local millet elite. They enriched themselves while antagonizing their own communities. But the empire's greatest problem was intellectual stagnation. Ottoman education had become rigid, focused on memorizing classical texts rather than innovation. The Islamic religious establishment, the ulema, resisted scientific and technological change as potential heresy. When Sultan Murad III established an observatory in Istanbul in 1577, the ulema pressured him to close it within approximately 3 years, claiming astronomical observation was impious. The observatory was demolished. In contrast, European universities were embracing scientific inquiry. The scientific revolution transformed European understanding of mathematics, astronomy, physics, chemistry, and biology. European powers translated scientific texts, conducted experiments, and shared findings. The Ottoman Empire, which had once been at the forefront of mathematics and astronomy, fell behind. Military technology diverged. European armies adopted new infantry tactics using muskets and artillery. They developed professional officer corps and systematic training. The Ottomans still relied on the Janissaries and Sipahi cavalry, tactics that had worked in the 15th and 16th centuries but were now obsolete. They were fighting 17th century wars with 15th century methods. The gap was about to become obvious. The gap became catastrophically obvious at Vienna in 1683. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led approximately 140,000 troops to Vienna in July. He expected an easy victory. Vienna had only 15,000 defenders, plus 11,000 civilians. But Kara Mustafa made multiple tactical errors. He rejected the garrison's offer to surrender, hoping to plunder the wealthy city. He didn't breach the walls before winter, believing starvation would force surrender. A relief army assembled. John III Sobieski, King of Poland, led 60,000 troops south. On September 12, 1683, the relief army attacked Kara Mustafa's besieging forces. The Polish hussars, heavy cavalry and winged armor, led one of the largest cavalry charges in history down the hills around Vienna. The Ottoman army broke and fled. Kara Mustafa abandoned his camp, including the campaign treasury, thousands of camels and horses, and hundreds of cannons. The relief forces captured everything. Kara Mustafa fled back to Belgrade, where Sultan Mehmed IV ordered him executed by strangulation on December 25th. The failure at Vienna triggered the Great Turkish War from 1683 to 1699. Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia formed a holy league and attacked the empire simultaneously. For the first time, The Ottomans faced a coordinated multi-front war with powers that had superior military technology. The empire lost catastrophically. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 forced the Ottomans to cede Hungary, Transylvania, Croatia, and significant territories. It was the first time the empire signed a peace treaty as the defeated party, accepting territorial losses to European powers. The age of Ottoman expansion was definitively over. The age of Ottoman retreat had begun, and it would last 2 centuries. The 18th century brought more defeats. Peter the Great of Russia defeated the Ottomans repeatedly, gaining access to the Black Sea. Russia would remain the empire's greatest enemy for the next 200 years. The Austro-Ottoman wars continued intermittently. The empire won occasional battles, but lost more territory with each peace treaty. Internally, the empire's problems multiplied. Provincial governors became increasingly independent, ruling their territories as effectively autonomous kingdoms. The Janissaries grew more powerful and more corrupt. They dominated Istanbul's politics and economy, running protection rackets and operating as a violent mob. Some sultans attempted reform. Ahmed III ruled during the Tulip era from 1718 to 1730, a period of relative peace and cultural flowering. He invited European advisors and tried to modernize the army. The Janissaries revolted in 1730, burned Istanbul for 2 days, and forced Ahmed to abdicate. The pattern repeated: attempt reform, face Janissary revolt, abandon reform, lose more wars. Mustafa III ruled from 1757 to 1774 and attempted naval reforms. Catherine the Great of Russia responded by invading Crimea. The Treaty of Küçükkaynarca in 1774 forced the empire to cede territories around the Black Sea and, most humiliatingly, to recognize Russia as the protector of Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. This gave Russia a pretext to interfere in Ottoman internal affairs for the next century. By the late 18th century, European diplomats were calling the empire the sick man of Europe, a phrase that would become famous in the 19th century. European powers debated not whether the empire would collapse, but when and how to divide its territories. Yet the empire would survive another century and a half because the European powers couldn't agree on how to partition it. No single power could conquer the empire without other powers intervening. Russia wanted the Bosporus and Constantinople. Britain wanted Russia blocked from the Mediterranean. Austria wanted the Balkans. France wanted Syria and Egypt. Each power prevented the others from taking too much. The Ottoman Empire survived because its enemies were also each other's enemies. But survival required reform. The question was whether reform was still possible. Selim III became Sultan in 1789, the same year the French Revolution began. He watched European armies smash through Ottoman defenses and recognized that the empire needed fundamental military reform. He created the Nizam-e-Jadid, New Order, a modern army trained by European advisors, equipped with European weapons, and organized on European lines. The Janissaries revolted in 1807. They stormed the palace and demanded the Nizam-e-Jadid be disbanded. Selim capitulated, abolished the new army, and was deposed shortly after. His successor Mustafa IV reigned for 14 months before being deposed. Mahmud II became Sultan in 1808 and understood that meaningful reform required destroying the Janissaries. Mahmud spent 18 years carefully building alternative military forces and political support. In June 1826, when the Janissaries revolted again, Mahmud was ready. He declared the Janissaries rebels and ordered his artillery to fire on their barracks. The bombardment killed thousands. Survivors were hunted through Istanbul. Within days, approximately 6,000 Janissaries were dead, exiled, or imprisoned. Mahmud called this the auspicious event. He abolished the Janissary Corps, which had existed for nearly 500 years, and created a modern army trained by European advisors. For the first time since the 17th century, the Ottoman military could potentially match European forces. The system that built the empire was finally dead, but so much time had been lost. But Mahmud's reforms couldn't stop territorial losses. Greece declared independence in 1821. A brutal war followed. European powers intervened on Greece's side, destroying the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Navarino in 1827. Greece achieved independence in 1832. This was a new and terrifying development. For the first time, an Ottoman territory didn't just change hands to another empire, it became an independent nation-state based on ethnic nationalism. If Greeks could become independent, why not Serbs? Why not Bulgarians, Romanians, Armenians, or Arabs? The Greek Revolution inspired nationalist movements across the empire. Egypt, under Muhammad Ali Pasha, grew effectively independent. Muhammad Ali had been sent to Egypt as an Ottoman governor, but built his own modern army and expanded into Sudan and Syria. By 1839, Egyptian forces were threatening Istanbul. Only European intervention, ironically, forced Muhammad Ali to withdraw. Mahmud died in 1839. His son Abdul-Majid I continued reforms with the Tanzimat, reorganization, a period from 1839 to 1876 of sweeping legal and administrative changes. The Tanzimat guaranteed legal equality for all subjects, regardless of religion, reformed taxation and administration, created secular courts alongside religious ones, and attempted to create an Ottoman citizenship that transcended ethnicity and religion. The Tanzimat reforms were revolutionary in theory, but failed in practice. Local administrators often ignored reform decrees. The empire's fiscal crisis worsened because reforms cost money the empire didn't have. The empire borrowed heavily from European banks, creating debts it couldn't repay. By 1875, the empire was effectively bankrupt. In 1881, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, controlled by European creditors, took over much of the empire's finances. More immediately, the Tanzimat failed to stop nationalist revolts. Revolts erupted in Bosnia, Bulgaria, and Crete. The empire's brutal suppressions created humanitarian crises that gave European powers excuses to intervene. When the empire massacred approximately 12,000 Bulgarians during the April Uprising of 1876, European public opinion turned decisively against the Ottomans. Russia declared war in 1877. Russian forces pushed through the Balkans and reached the outskirts of Istanbul. Only British threats to enter the war forced Russia to accept a peace treaty. The Congress of Berlin in June and July 1878 redrew the map. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro became independent. Bulgaria became an autonomous principality. Austria, Hungary occupied Bosnia and Herzegovina. Britain took Cyprus. Russia kept territorial gains in the Caucasus. The Ottoman Empire lost hundreds of thousands of square kilometers and millions of people. The empire was being carved apart while still alive. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who had ruled since 1876, responded by suspending the constitution and ruling as an absolute monarch. He spent the next 30 years trying to hold the empire together through authoritarian control, extensive spy networks, and playing European powers against each other. Abdul Hamid emphasized pan-Islamism, promoting Ottoman leadership of the Islamic world to counter ethnic nationalism. He used his position as caliph to build support among Muslims across continents. He modernized infrastructure, building railroads including the Hejaz Railway connecting Damascus to Medina. He reformed education and expanded telegraph networks. But circumstances were catastrophic. In 1894 and 1895, Armenian revolutionaries seeking greater autonomy launched uprisings. Abdul Hamid responded with massacres. Estimates range from 100,000 to 300,000 Armenian deaths in what became known as the Hamidian massacres. The atrocities damaged the empire's international reputation and radicalized Armenian nationalist groups. In 1908, military officers called the Young Turks forced Abdul Hamid to restore the constitution. The Young Turks believed constitutionalism and modernization could save the empire. They were idealistic, nationalist, and utterly unprepared for the catastrophes that followed. The empire's remaining years can be counted in disasters. In 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1911, Italy invaded Libya and the Dodecanese Islands. In 1912, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro formed the Balkan League and attacked the empire. The First Balkan War lasted 8 months. The empire lost almost all its remaining European territory, except eastern Thrace and a strip around Istanbul. The empire's European territory shrank from hundreds of thousands of square kilometers to approximately 26,000. The population declined from approximately 24 million to about 21 million. In a single year, centuries of expansion were reversed. In 1913, the Balkan League powers turned on each other in the Second Balkan War. The empire recovered Edirne, but nothing else. The Treaty of Bucharest confirmed the empire's expulsion from most of Europe. The Young Turks, now led by a triumvirate of Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, became increasingly authoritarian and nationalist. They promoted Turkish nationalism over Ottoman multi-ethnicism. They allied with Germany, believing German military strength would protect the empire from Russia and restore lost territories. This decision would destroy what remained of the empire. World War I annihilated the Ottoman Empire. On October 29, 1914, the Ottoman fleet bombarded Russian ports on the Black Sea without declaring war. Russia responded by declaring war on November 2nd. Britain and France declared war on November 5th. The empire was now fighting Russia, Britain, France, and eventually Italy on multiple fronts with obsolete equipment and a weakened economy. The empire had moments of success. At Gallipoli from February 1915 to January 1916, Ottoman forces under Mustafa Kemal defeated a British and French invasion force trying to capture Istanbul. The victory was one of the war's greatest Allied disasters and made Mustafa Kemal a national hero. But success at Gallipoli couldn't compensate for defeats everywhere else. Russian forces advanced through eastern Anatolia. British forces advanced through Mesopotamia and Palestine. Arab forces, aided by T.E. Lawrence, revolted and captured Damascus. By October 1918, the empire was finished. The Armistice of Mudros on October 30th, 1918, ended Ottoman participation in the war. The terms were devastating. Allied forces could occupy any strategic points. The empire had to demobilize its army and surrender its warships. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles were opened to Allied ships. But the worst atrocity of the war years had already occurred. In April 1915, claiming Armenian disloyalty and fear of Russian advancement, the Young Turk government ordered the deportation of Armenians from eastern Anatolia to Syria and Mesopotamia. The deportations became death marches. Armenians were forced to walk hundreds of miles without adequate food, water, or shelter. Guards massacred entire convoys. Women were raped. Children were kidnapped or killed. Villages were burned. Most Western historians estimate between 800,000 and 1.5 million Armenian deaths between 1915 and 1923, with approximately 1 million being the most commonly cited figure. The Republic of Turkey disputes the term genocide and argues that deaths occurred on all sides during wartime chaos, claiming 300,000 to 600,000 deaths during relocations. Multiple governments and numerous historians recognize the events as genocide. The tragedy radicalized surviving Armenians and poisoned relations for generations. As the war ended, the empire was occupied. British forces occupied Istanbul and the Straits. French forces occupied southern Anatolia. Italian forces occupied southwestern Anatolia. Greek forces, with Allied approval, occupied Smyrna and pushed into western Anatolia. The empire's heartland, Anatolia itself, was being partitioned. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed on August 10, 1920, formalized the partition. The treaty reduced the empire to a small state in northern Anatolia. Eastern Anatolia would become an Armenian state. Southeastern Anatolia would be autonomous Kurdistan with the possibility of independence. Western Anatolia would be under Greek administration. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles would be internationalized. The empire would have no army larger than 50,000 men. Sultan Mehmed VI accepted the treaty. He had no choice. Istanbul was occupied. But in Anatolia, resistance was forming, and that resistance would save what was left. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, had gone to Anatolia in May 1919. Instead of overseeing demobilization, he organized resistance. He declared that the Istanbul government, under occupation, could not represent Turkish interests. He convened the Grand National Assembly in Ankara in April 1920. This assembly claimed to be the legitimate government of Turkey. The Turkish War of Independence lasted from 1919 to 1922. Mustafa Kemal's forces fought French forces in the south, Armenian forces in the east, and Greek forces in the west. It was a brutal war of attrition, fought with limited resources against better-equipped opponents. The decisive campaign was against Greece. Greek forces pushed deep into Anatolia, reaching within 200 kilometers of Ankara by August 1921. Mustafa Kemal stopped them at the Battle of Sakarya, a 21-day battle that was one of the longest in modern history. The Greek army retreated to defensive positions near the coast. In August 1922, Mustafa Kemal launched the Great Offensive. In just over 2 weeks, his forces routed the Greek army, which fled to the coast. On September 9th, Turkish forces entered Smyrna. What followed was catastrophe. Much of Smyrna burned. Estimates of deaths range from 10,000 to 100,000, mostly Greeks and Armenians. The Christian population fled by ship or died. The Turkish victory forced a new peace treaty. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed on July 24, 1923, recognized Turkish sovereignty over Anatolia and eastern Thrace. All foreign forces would leave Turkish territory. The Straits would be demilitarized but under Turkish control. Most significantly, the treaty included a population exchange between Turkey and Greece. Over 1 million Greeks left Anatolia. Over 380,000 Muslims left Greece. Communities that had lived in these places for millennia were forcibly relocated based on religion. The Grand National Assembly had already abolished the Sultanate on November 1st, 1922. Sultan Mehmed VI fled Istanbul on a British warship on November 17th. For the first time in 623 years, there was no Ottoman Sultan. The Ottoman Empire still technically existed. Mehmed's cousin, Abdülmecid II, was appointed caliph, a purely religious position with no political power. But on March 3, 1924, the Grand National Assembly abolished the caliphate. Abdülmecid and the entire Ottoman dynasty were exiled. They were forbidden to return to Turkey and stripped of their citizenship. The Ottoman Empire was gone. The Republic of Turkey was born, and the new republic would define itself by rejecting everything the empire had been. Mustafa Kemal, now called Ataturk, father of the Turks, embarked on radical reforms. He abolished Islamic courts and replaced them with secular Swiss civil law. He banned the fez and encouraged Western dress. He gave women the right to vote. He replaced Arabic script with Latin alphabet. He moved the capital from Istanbul to Ankara. He banned Sufi orders and religious brotherhoods. He removed Islam as the state religion from the constitution. These reforms were revolutionary, imposed top-down in the name of modernization. Ataturk saw the Ottoman Empire's failure as the failure of tradition, religion, and multi-ethnic imperialism. His solution was secular Turkish nationalism. Turkey would be European, modern, and Turkish. The Ottoman past was an embarrassment to be overcome. Ottoman symbols were banned. Using the title Sultan or Pasha became illegal. Ottoman history was taught as a cautionary tale. The empire that had ruled for over 6 centuries was erased from public life within a decade. The empire's collapse traumatized its former subjects. In the Balkans, new nation-states fought over borders the empire had controlled for centuries. In the Middle East, British and French mandates created artificial borders that ignored ethnic and religious divisions. The population exchanges and massacres created permanent refugee communities scattered across continents. The empire's institutions vanished almost immediately. The devshirme system had been abolished in the 17th century. The janissaries were destroyed in 1826. The millet system ended with the republic's emphasis on citizenship over religious identity. The caliphate was abolished. The sultanate was abolished. The dynasty was exiled. Within months, 6 centuries of institutions disappeared. But the empire's legacy persisted in unexpected ways. The Balkans' ethnic and religious complexity, which caused wars in the 1990s, was shaped by Ottoman rule. The Middle East's borders, which have caused endless conflicts, were drawn by European powers dividing Ottoman territories. Turkey's secular Islamist divide, which defines its modern politics, emerged from the gap between Ottoman tradition and Kemalist modernization. 6 centuries, 3 continents, dozens of peoples, all gone in less than a decade. Looking across 6 centuries, from Osman's small beylik to the empire's collapse, the pattern becomes clear. The empire rose because it was flexible. It incorporated Christians into its military and administration. It allowed religious autonomy through the millet system. It rewarded merit through the devshirme system. It adapted tactics and technology from enemies. Early sultans were capable administrators and military commanders because incompetence meant death. The empire declined when flexibility became rigidity. The devshirme system was abandoned for nepotism. The millet system became a tool for exploitation. The Janissaries transformed from the empire's greatest strength to its greatest weakness. Sultans became figureheads imprisoned in golden cages. The ulema rejected scientific progress. The empire stopped adapting. This isn't just one failure, it's a cascade. Each system that created success eventually blocked adaptation. Watch how it compounds. The devshirme creates capable administrators. But when it becomes hereditary, incompetence buy officers. When incompetence govern, provinces suffer. When provinces suffer, rebellions start. When rebellions start, the empire needs capable generals. Of the capable generals were eliminated by harem politics. So the empire loses wars. Losing wars means losing territory. Losing territory means losing tax revenue. Losing tax revenue means borrowing from Europeans. Borrowing from Europeans means losing economic sovereignty. Losing economic sovereignty means reforms can't be funded. And the cycle continues, accelerating until the whole structure collapses. Military stagnation killed the empire. Between 1453 and 1526, Ottoman armies were unmatched in Europe. Superior tactics, discipline, and artillery overwhelmed feudal opponents. But the empire stopped innovating, while European powers created professional armies, modern logistics, and industrial weapons production. By the 19th century, Ottoman armies were generations behind. Every war demonstrated the gap. Every reform attempt came too late and did too little. Economic peripheralization hollowed out the empire. The shift of trade routes from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic reduced Ottoman revenue. The influx of American silver caused inflation the government couldn't control. European economic penetration gave foreign merchants advantages over Ottoman subjects. By the 19th century, the empire was economically dependent on European loans. Nationalism destroyed the empire's multi-ethnic foundation. The French Revolution introduced the idea that political legitimacy came from ethnic nations rather than multi-ethnic empires. Serbian, Greek, Bulgarian, Arab, and Turkish nationalism defined themselves against each other and against the empire. The empire had been based on religious rather than ethnic identity. No reform could satisfy nationalist movements that wanted independence, not autonomy. The empire collapsed not from one cause, but from the intersection of multiple failures. Military weakness invited aggression. Economic dependency limited options. Nationalist movements tore at internal cohesion. Institutional sclerosis prevented effective reform. By 1914, the empire was a shell, maintained only because European powers couldn't agree how to divide it. World War I destroyed that balance. The war bankrupted the empire, destroyed its army, and discredited its government. The Young Turks' atrocities against Armenians ensured no sympathy from victorious allies. The Treaty of Sèvres planned to partition even Anatolia. Only Mustafa Kemal's military victory saved the Turkish core. But even that victory required rejecting the Ottoman past. The Republic defined itself as not Ottoman, not Islamic, not imperial. Everything the empire represented was wrong. Ataturk's reforms weren't just modernization, they were cultural revolution imposed from above, replacing Ottoman identity with Turkish nationalism. The strangest irony is timing. The empire collapsed just as its reforms might have succeeded. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century anticipated many of Ataturk's 20th century changes: constitutional government, legal equality, secular education, modern military, economic reform. They failed partly from external pressures, partly from internal resistance, partly from terrible timing. If the empire had avoided World War I, could it have survived? Probably not. Nationalist movements were too strong. European imperialism was too aggressive. The economic gap was too wide. But the empire's collapse wasn't inevitable in 1453, when Mehmet conquered Constantinople. The seeds of collapse were planted during the zenith and took centuries to grow. The Ottoman Empire lasted from approximately 1300 to 1922, over 600 years. In that time, it ruled 3 continents, controlled the holy cities of Islam, shaped the Balkans and Middle East, and influenced European history profoundly. At its peak, it was one of the world's great powers. Its collapse created modern Turkey, traumatized millions, and established borders and conflicts that persist today. The empire's story isn't just about rise and fall. It's about how institutions that create success become obstacles to adaptation, how flexibility becomes rigidity, how empires plant the seeds of their own destruction at the height of their power. 6 centuries is longer than most states in human history. The Ottoman Empire survived the Black Death, the Age of Exploration, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of nationalism. It adapted and survived where other empires fell. But adaptation has limits. When the rate of change exceeds an institution's ability to reform, collapse follows. The Ottoman Empire faced challenges in the 19th century that no traditional empire could overcome. European industrialization, nationalism, and imperialism created a world where multi-ethnic empires based on pre-modern institutions couldn't compete. The empire's end was brutal. Wars, massacres, deportations, ethnic cleansing, refugee crises, millions died. Millions more were displaced. Ancient communities were destroyed. The 20th century's catastrophes in the Balkans and Middle East have roots in the empire's collapse. The empire also left achievements. Ottoman architecture still stands across 3 continents. Ottoman administrative practices influenced successor states. The empire's religious tolerance, however imperfect, allowed diverse communities to coexist for centuries. Ultimately, the Ottoman Empire's legacy remains complicated, contested, and impossible to separate from modern politics. In Turkey, the empire is controversial. In the Balkans, it's remembered mostly for oppression. In the Arab world, Ottoman rule is remembered ambiguously. For Armenians, the empire's end means genocide and permanent diaspora. For Greeks, it means the Asia Minor catastrophe. For Kurds, It means being divided among multiple successor states. The empire rose from a small frontier principality because of flexibility, military innovation, and strategic geography. It fell because those advantages disappeared, and the empire couldn't adapt fast enough. 6 centuries is a long time for any institution. But empires don't last forever. The Ottoman Empire's story is the story of all empires. Success creates institutions. Institutions resist change. The world changes anyway. Empires that can't adapt fall. The Ottoman collapse took 3 centuries, from the failure at Vienna in 1683 to the abolition of the Sultanate in 1922. 3 centuries of slow decline, punctuated by catastrophic defeats, attempted reforms, and finally total collapse in World War I. The empire that lasted 6 centuries is gone, but its shadow stretches across the modern world in borders, conflicts, identities, and memories. The Balkans' ethnic complexity, the Middle East's artificial borders, Turkey's secular Islamist divide, Armenian diaspora, Greek population exchange, Kurdish statelessness. These are all legacies of the Ottoman Empire's rise and fall. Empires rise when they adapt and incorporate. They fall when they ossify and exclude. The Ottoman Empire adapted for centuries and survived longer than almost any other state in history. When it finally stopped adapting, it collapsed within a generation. The lesson isn't that empires always fall. The lesson is that survival requires constant adaptation. The Ottoman Empire understood this for centuries. That's why it lasted so long. When it forgot, it collapsed. The empire that conquered Constantinople, ruled the Mediterranean, and made Europe tremble finally couldn't survive the modern world it had helped create.